There's no more interesting story in the modern pop culture landscape than the tale of Spider-Man. In many respects, the character was responsible for ushering in the modern era of superhero dominance in the early 2000s and perfected the winning superhero template that was beginning to take shape in the X-Men and Blade movies. He was easily the crown jewel of Marvel Comics, their most enduring and successful character, who was sadly controlled entirely by Sony. Thanks to the success of the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, Sony could keep the rights to the character as long as they continued to develop more movies, and they had such success with him that they even used the Spider-Man font for the PS3 logo. Of course, this made things difficult for Marvel, given the fact that Spider-Man was one of their most defining, recognizable, and iconic characters, a fact proven by the huge success of the Raimi Spider-Man film trilogy. Marvel would never get him back officially. But what if I told you that during the height of the success of the MCU, right after the premiere of Avengers, that Marvel and Disney conspired to pull off one of the greatest pieces of intellectual property subterfuge that the world has ever seen? What if I told you that Marvel intentionally sabotaged their greatest character in order to regain creative control over him? What if I told you that Marvel intentionally salted the earth for an entire generation of children to ensure that they would never see Spider-Man the same way again? Join me now as we explore how Marvel killed Spider-Man so they could get him back. You gotta love to be got it back, yeah. Love is a dead, don't you grab it. So this story begins in the mid-90s during Marvel's infamous bankruptcy, where they were forced to sell the movie rights to some of their most lucrative characters. It's how they lost the rights to X-Men, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Daredevil, and the Incredible Hulk. Most of these were given away in deals, where as long as the respective studios continued to create movies based on the characters, they could hold on to the rights indefinitely. One of my favorite examples of this is when German film producer Bert Eichinger literally paid Roger Corman to make a low-budget Fantastic Four movie that he would never release just so he could keep the rights to the characters, while we really didn't see the superhero boom really take off until the early 2000s, when digital technology had finally caught up to a point where visualizing the fantastic battles and superpowers from the comics became a technical reality that was financially feasible. And of course, the great pillar leading the charge was the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Now, Marvel would never quite be able to get him back from Sony after they lost the rights to him, but there was a more insidious way they could slowly erode the Spider-Man brand to hasten the poor management on Sony's part and force them to the bargaining table. So while not quite as beloved as the slate of DC animated TV series, Marvel did have quite a catalog of animated series from the 90s. One of Marvel CEO Ike Perlmutter's greatest strengths was working as a toy executive, and there is no greater way to sell toys than with cartoon shows. And the Marvel animated universe had several interconnected series like the X-Men and Spider-Man series, along with less successful ones like the Hulk and Fantastic Four. And apparently King of the Hill as well, seeing as how Hank Hill hung out with the Silver Surfer.
Mr. Surfer, have you ever considered propane as an alternative energy source for that board of yours? With a little retooling, I could get it to work.
Yes, that's right, Hank Hill MCU confirmed, because someone in the 90s thought kids would just love seeing a Saturday morning crossover with the adult animated series, which featured constant jokes about Hank's infertility due to his narrow urethra. It's a match made in heaven because they're both cartoons, right? King of the Hill tangent aside, these shows would see numerous crossovers building an interconnected universe. The character of Spider-Man would see himself in several different animated series throughout the years, including the weird Spider-Man Unlimited, where he would travel to a planet ruled by evil furries and helped aid an underground human resistance. The weird CGI animated series The New Adventures of Spider-Man, which served as a quasi-canonical sequel to the first Raimi film that aired on MTV for some reason, as well as the cult classic Spectacular Spider-Man that was cancelled far too soon. What came in 2012 was Ultimate Spider-Man, launching around the same time as the Avengers hit theaters. Ultimate Spider-Man focused on a more teenage Peter Parker. Now, this is something we've seen before in other Spider-Man series. Where things get interesting is how they frame this version of Peter Parker. Usually the core appeal of Spider-Man is that he's alone. He works independently, he doesn't have a team or a mansion to retreat to, he's just a guy who's forced to wash his Spidey suit at the local laundromat. But the Ultimate Spider-Man sees Peter Parker under the tutelage of Nick Fury, who is seeking to teach him how to become a better superhero. And he trains alongside teenage versions of Iron Fist, Luke Cage, Nova, and White Tiger. What makes this especially interesting is how Spider-Man looks up to Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America. The entire conceit of the series is basically Spider-Man aspiring to be as capable and cool as the Marvel mainstay characters seen in their mainstream MCU movies. In response to that, this version of Spider-Man is easily the most puerile, dumb, and goofy version of the character ever seen on the small screen, constantly using fourth wall breaks to talk directly to the audience.
My best friend's dad is a homicidal maniac who's been trying to destroy me? How did I miss that?
This seems especially insidious because while Marvel could not use him in feature films, they still had the rights to make cartoons based off the character and ultimately mold children's perception of him to undercut his appeal, to have Spider-Man be less of an independent character and instead someone who ultimately looks up to the characters they still have control over. He aspires to be like Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, essentially the three mainline movie franchise characters. Forget with great power comes great responsibility, Spider-Man's entire goal and reason for being throughout the entire 104 episode, 4-season run of the series is to match and become as great as the mainline Marvel heroes that are mainstays of the MCU. Now, if you don't think that's subterfuge, I don't know what is. To essentially create an animated series targeted at children telling them, hey, you know how you like Spider-Man because he's relatable and has problems like you? Well, you know who Spider-Man looks up to and wants to be like? All the heroes we have the movie rights to. It's basically corporate propaganda targeting the most impressionable audience in order to subvert the mainstream efforts of Sony to relaunch Spider-Man, because you know what premiered at the same year as Ultimate Spider-Man? Why, Sony's Amazing Spider-Man. Indeed. So while Sony struggled to get their rebooted Mark Webb trilogy off the ground, Marvel on Disney XD was slowly convincing millions of children that even Spider-Man himself thought the Avengers were cooler than he could ever be. What's more interesting is how the Ultimate Spider-Man was used as a jumping point to create a new Marvel animated universe, which saw the creation of Avengers Assemble, Hulk and the Agents of Smash, and a Guardians of the Galaxy animated series as well. All these series shared a similar art style and an aesthetic that was inspired by the mainline MCU films, while liberally borrowing elements and storylines from contemporary comic series. Largely, these series were snubbed by mainstream comic book fans and fanboy man-children alike, and were not as beloved as similar series like the 90s Spider-Man animated series or the award-winning Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon, but they seem to serve their purpose in branding by giving a more kid-friendly, sanitized, PG-friendly version of the MCU films, and building their own cross-continuity where characters could cross over from one series to another, despite some continuity errors, like the Hulk being an inarticulate brute in the Avengers cartoons, but then having the ability to give articulate monologues in a reality show-style cutaways in Agents of Smash.
The leader. Been trying to destroy me and take over the world long as I can remember. Why allow a mole on my team? Keep your friends close, your enemies closer.
Because I guess kids love that for some reason. But this all came to a head as Sony stumbled to get their Amazing Spider-Man films afoot. After the success of the MCU, there was a great amount of pressure for Sony to accomplish something similar, and their grand ambition, and honestly an ambition they're still trying to fulfill, is to use their control of the Spider-Man IP to create a Spider-Man cinematic universe. And they had movie spin-offs for everything in the works, including The Sinister Six, Black Cat, Silver Sable, Mobius the Living Vampire, Kraven the Hunter, Silk, Jackpot, Night Watch, and at one point there were even talks of an Aunt May spin-off movie. And this should have been easy, right? I mean, the world loves Spider-Man. He's easily more recognizable and beloved than a character like Thor, Captain America, or even Iron Man, who were all B-list characters until they weren't, thanks to movies that people actually liked. But through their sheer incompetence, Sony managed to screw that up as well. They tried to bill their reboot as the untold story that would finally reveal the truth behind the mystery no Spider-Man fan ever really cared about. What happened to Peter Parker's parents? But the thing is, nobody has ever really cared about the true story behind Peter Parker's parents. It also had the worst sin of modern franchise filmmaking, the sin of setting up sequels and spin-offs to get the audience to think, oh, maybe the next one will be better. And while technically neither of the two movies did poorly, with the first one making $757 million and the sequel making $709 million, in an age where Iron Man and Captain America are crossing $1 billion, it was expected that the most beloved superhero should have been able to manage that. And the fact that Marvel launched the Ultimate Spider-Man in 2012 at the same time Sony was trying to launch The Amazing Spider-Man most definitely served as a way to undermine their attempts at building up their new Spider-Man brand. But from here is where we go from simply being a smattering of coincidences into 9/11 truth or conspiracy territory. So the unthinkable happens. Sony comes to the bargaining table with Marvel. They sign a co-production deal that will give Marvel creative control and the ability to create a Spider-Man that exists in the MCU. Everyone's happy. Everyone's ecstatic and goes ape shit over Civil War, where he makes his debut. Then comes his relaunch in Spider-Man Homecoming, which easily trumps anything Sony has been able to do by reintegrating him back into the MCU. But how does Marvel do this? By having a teenage Spider-Man who looks up to the Avengers and serves as a protege of Iron Man. Yep, that's right. Spider-Man is yet again a young teenager who is at a far lower stature than the mainline Marvel heroes. An entire generation has grown up seeing a cartoon Spider-Man who thinks Iron Man and Captain America are far better than him, where he looks up to and aspires to be like them. Now the mainline film franchise follows that as well. But then it goes even a step further. In Spider-Man Far From Home, we see Spider-Man as being recruited by Nick Fury himself, just like he was in Ultimate Spider-Man. Everything has come full circle. It was all connected. It was all planned from the start. Marvel is literally salting the earth, so even when Spider-Man does eventually get rebooted and return back to Sony, he will always be Marvel's bitch. A character who ultimately looks up more to the mainline Marvel heroes than anyone in his respective universe. You think it's a coincidence that Sony's pushing so hard to produce movies like Venom and create a Spider-Man universe without Spider-Man? They know they made their deal with the devil and are looking to create any kind of footing they can, because the MCU Spider-Man will always be subservient to the other heroes in the MCU. Marvel slowly sabotaged Spider-Man in order to get him back, and they are working hard to make sure that he will always remain unusable in Sony's hands, so that they are always dependent on giving Marvel creative control. Not to say that this isn't Sony's fault. They also have themselves to blame for making one boneheaded decision after another, and being easily one of the most poorly run mainstream film studios that only occasionally seems to blunder their way into success by accident. Their default paradigm has been to do the stupidest thing possible. And nowhere is it more apparent than in my favorite email that came out from the Sony hacks, a communique between former MTV president Nick Shore giving a few suggestions on how Amy Pascal, the former president of Sony Pictures, could keep Spider-Man hip and relevant and appeal to those fickle tastes of those gosh darn millennials. Spidey thought, "Hey Amy, just a couple of rando thoughts from 35,000 up in LAX JFK. A rising trend we see with millennials are the really extreme forms of experimental exercise, like the Tough Mudder, a sort of filthy triathlon, and the Color Run, and even things like hot power yoga, veganism, etc. Millennials will often post MBD on their social media after doing it, as in, no big deal, also known as the humble brag, wondering if Spidey can get into that in some way. He's super athletic, bendy, strong, intense, and it's all MBD to him, of course. EDM, electronic dance music, is the defining music for millennials. Wondering if there's an EDM angle somewhere with Spidey. His movements are beautiful, would be awesome with a killer DJ behind it. Snapchat just launched a story functionality, which is sort of a day in the life of me, told in a series of Snapchats that expire after 24 hours. It has a very VIP quality about it, since it's invitation only. Getting invited into Spidey's Snapchat circle would be huge, and very buzzworthy and cool. Now, most of those insufferable flash-in-the-pan ideas never made it into the final movie, except for one, and I think we all know the one I'm talking about.
You lied to me!
No, I'm trying to help. Let me help you.
I hate this song!
So as much as Marvel might have salted the fields, the blame for the collapse of the Amazing Spider-Man cinematic universe, complete with Aunt May's spin-off movie, lays at their feet. It's their incompetence that forced them to the table to negotiate with Marvel and Disney, and ultimately work out a deal that will be destructive to their brand in the long run. Now, if you really want to believe there is no validity into this Spidey conspiracy malarkey, let me tell you this. I went to a panel with Joe Quesada at San Diego Comic-Con, and I asked him this exact question: if they were using the Ultimate Spider-Man as a way to sabotage the character to win him back from Sony. I wish I had footage of this, but I don't. But I swear it happened. He gave a very not amused, no response reply to get rid of me, and tried to move on to the next question. But then, as if God himself wanted to punish him for turning me away, was asked why they were touting their diversity agenda when the panel only consisted of straight white men, which ironically my favorite comic boy, Kieran Gillen, was also on, and he looked so very uncomfortable. So there you have it. Officially, Marvel was just trying to make a cartoon that kids would love, but I've laid out my evidence. What do you think? Do you think that for the past 5 to 6 years we've been watching corporate subterfuge by Marvel and Disney to win Spidey back? Or is it all just a bunch of coincidences? Or maybe Sony should just make Phil Lord and Chris Miller handle every Spider-Man movie, because let's be honest, Into the Spider-Verse was freaking great, and I'm annoyed that most of you probably didn't see it and went to see Venom instead. Seriously, what the hell? But thanks for sticking around and hearing my thoughts, and remember, lobster's antennas, but don't you grab it.